If you're an Edexcel A-Level Business student looking for a video to revise all of Theme 3.6 Managing Change, well, this video is for you, because we're going to go through everything that you need to know for your exams, including the different causes and effects of change. Then we'll look at how we go about identifying risks, and then finally we'll finish off the session looking at scenario planning. Let's get into it. The first topic that we'll take a look at in this revision video will be the different causes and effects of change. Now, the reason why change happens typically comes from both internal and external influences, and we've got several different factors. First of all, a change in the organisational size. We may have experienced poor performance. We may have seen new ownership. Also, a change in leadership. And finally, due to different external factors. And we're going to break down each of these individual factors and why they actually cause change. And we need to know how do each of these causes of change actually start to impact the business. And the themes that we'll take a look at in terms of how it will impact the business. Well, first of all, it will be around the competitiveness of the company. Then it will be about the productivity levels. Then we'll also look at how it could impact our financial performance. And finally, how it could impact various different stakeholders of the company. So I'll be bringing in some of these different factors when we look at the different causes of change. Starting off with the changes in organisational size. Now, the whole aim for a business is to try and grow, make more revenue, make more profit, bring on new employees, expanding to new markets. So if the business is changing in their organisational size, potentially expanding and growing, well, they're gonna have to hire more staff. And to ensure the business is coordinating their activities in the best way possible, we need to make sure there's greater structure through more established processes and policies. So how does this start to impact the business? Now, we know that as the business starts to grow, they begin to get access to more economies of scale. So the level of output is increasing, which can lead the unit cost to reduce. And we know from Porter's generic strategies that there are two main sources of a way for a business to gain and sustain a competitive advantage, either through low cost or through differentiation. Well, we know economies of scale is going to help the business with their low cost strategy because their unit costs are reducing. But also, as the business is growing in size, they may want to start attracting more talented employees because they may have larger financial resources to invest in the business's research and development and innovation programs. And that could also lead to the business producing more products that are differentiated to their competitors. And of course, as the business will start to grow, we may look at more technical economies of scale. Now, technical economies of scale is when we use more machinery, more automation within our production processes. Now, if the business is using more automation and machinery, typically the overall productivity levels would increase because automation machinery has higher levels of efficiency than just typical employees would. And in terms of how it would impact the financial performance of the business, well, typically to fund business growth, the business may want to take on more debt, of course, depending on what their current gearing ratio is. Now, that can obviously damage the financial performance because taking on more debt can be a risky strategy because, of course, the costs of the business are increasing, and over the long term, it could negatively impact their cash flow. However, overall, if you are using that funding to help grow the business, maybe you've got a successful return on capital employed, then typically this will lead to better financial performance over that longer period of time. And in terms of how a change in organisational size impacts our different stakeholders, well, potentially for the employees, there may be more promotion opportunities. And for our shareholders, there's more returns for them because as the business is growing, the level of profit should also increase. So that would mean more dividends and an increase in their share price. But we also have to ask the question about the ethical concerns of the larger businesses. Because, for example, when looking at the supplier stakeholder, typically these larger businesses will try to negotiate lower prices, which can be unfair on that supplier. But that supplier may have to accept those lower prices because that larger business may be a vital source of income for them. We also have to think about the local communities. Are their voices being heard? And of course, with these larger businesses, and we'll take a look at this in a lot more detail across Theme 4, but what multinational corporations tend to do is they tend to exploit workers in developing countries where they know they can get away with lower wages. So as the business is growing, potentially we have to start asking questions about the ethical responsibilities. Next up, as we said, another important cause of change is down to poor business performance. Well, typically typically poor business performance comes from the fact of the business isn't doing well in the market, maybe they're losing customers, they're not making as many sales as they was, the profit levels have gone down, cost levels are beginning to increase. And this could come down to many different factors: poor economic conditions, have a damaged reputation, stronger levels of competition. So of course what begins to happen for the business, especially if we have damaged reputation, that our competitiveness starts to decrease. And as well, if we do see poor performance in the business, the level of sales typically start to go down. Now when we look at our capacity utilization, a topic that we looked at in theme 2, well, this would also start to begin to reduce because we're not utilizing our overall capacity as much because we're not making as many sales as we did before. So what happens to the overall levels of productivity? These start to go down. Unit cost starts to increase because our fixed costs are now spread over fewer units. And of course, when we look at poor business performance, this directly impacts our financial performance. So we may have a weak cash flow with less cash coming into the business. We also may have liquidity issues. So poorer cash flow performance may lead to a lower current ratio, may lead to a poorer asset test ratio, and our overall levels of working capital starts to go down. And if a business is performing poorly, typically they want to focus on cost cutting measures. And one of the biggest costs that a business will try to cut will be around their labour and their employees. So what you'll typically find is that the business starts making redundancies, and the current workforce, they may start to have motivational issues because their job security may come under threat. And I'm relating that to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, our level 2, our security and safety needs. And of course, poor performance would then impact a number of different stakeholders, such as shareholders because they're getting lower returns. Our suppliers may be worse off because we're not putting in as many orders as we was before. The next cause of change we can also look at is new ownership. Now, new ownership can come in different ways. First of all, we could go from more of a private limited company to a public limited company. So the ownership structure of the business starts to change dramatically because we're bringing on a lot of new shareholders who may not have personal connections with the business. Or it could be because of a merger or a takeover. So we've got a new company merging with ours, so the ownership structure has changed, or another company has completely taken over my company. Now, in terms of how the change in ownership starts to impact our competitiveness, well, typically, let's say if we was to look at a merger, well, the level of the business's output starts to increase quite dramatically overnight. So we know this could potentially lead to economies of scale, reducing our unit cost. However, the issue with growing too quickly is that our output may increase too much that we start running into control and coordination problems, leading to diseconomies of scale, so our unit cost starts to increase. So it could have either a really good impact on our competitiveness or a bad impact. And another factor that we may look into, maybe due to a merger and a takeover, is that we gain new expertise, new knowledge. And that could help lead to increasing the business's differentiation strategy. And in terms of how this impacts the business's financial performance, well, typically within the short term, it may start to damage it. Because looking at a stock market flotation, a merger or a takeover, typically these require high upfront costs. But over time, the reasons why we do this is because the amount of returns that we could be making would help us increase our financial performance over time. Now, in terms of how this may impact our stakeholders, once again, could be in a good way, could be in a negative way. I think in the short term period, especially after a merger, we may find that we've got job duplications. So I need to start making some redundancies within my business. So the employees as a stakeholder, once again, job security may come under threat, and that could negatively impact their motivation. But actually over the long term, productivity levels may also begin to start to increase because now we may have successfully merged the cultures and the systems together. And typically, after a merger and a takeover, over that long term, the financial rewards start to increase, as we mentioned earlier. So our shareholders start to become a lot happier as well. Another major cause of change can also be to do with transformational leadership. Now, what we mean by transformational leadership is when a new leader introduces a brand new vision and strategic direction, and they want to inspire a large change within a business. You know, new leaders can come into the company for numerous different reasons. Maybe the old CEO is coming towards the end of their career, or the old leadership team was leading the business down this poor financial performance path. So it kind of depends on, well, why has that new leader been brought into the company? Now, in terms of whether this is a good thing or is a bad thing, depends on how much change is happening. But typically during transformational leadership, a lot of changes happening in the company. Now, your employees, they may begin to resist this because they may prefer the old ways of the business, or they may prefer the old leadership team. And it also depends on where this new leader has come from. They may have already been an employee within the business, so they may not want to try and change too much. Or we could be looking externally to hire this new leader, where they've got a completely brand new vision to implement in the company. And the last major cause of change will also be to do with the market and external factors such as PESTEL. Now, by now we should know what PESTEL stands for: political, economic, social, technological, legal and environmental factors. Now, when we look at the external environment, this is an uncontrollable. I can't control what's happening externally. So when we look at how this starts to impact the business, is that we can only look at responding to change. So first of all, when it comes to those economic factors, are we in a growth phase of the business cycle, or are we in a recession? Because that may start to influence the level of consumer spending. When we look at the social factors, maybe there's been a change in different social trends. We could look at technological, so new advancements, the introduction to AI. We could also look at the L factor, the legal factors. Are there any new legislations? And a great example of how the change in legislation has impacted businesses is looking at our car manufacturers. Now, I think by around 2030 to 2050, the complete production of petrol and diesel cars will have to stop. So a lot of these car manufacturers are now having to innovate and bring in new ideas about producing more electric vehicles. Now, going over into a bit more detail about how this may impact our competitiveness, our productivity. Well, first of all, with technological advancements, hopefully the introduction to new technology can actually help the business become more efficient, especially within their production processes. And if we are introducing more autonomy and technology to improve the business's efficiency, then our productivity levels should also go up, which of course can help us become a little bit more competitive, because if productivity levels are up, typically our unit cost could go down, go into more of a low cost strategy from Porter's generic strategies. But the thing that you'll also have to factor in, it's not just my company who can get access to this, it's all the other companies as well. And obviously the technological advancements can help us develop new innovative products, more differentiated products. We've also seen as well that overall productivity levels have also improved because of the communication developments. Because if you look over 100 years ago, factors like email didn't exist, mobile phones didn't exist. How did they used to survive? But when we look at nowadays the development in communication technologies, I can communicate to someone across the world instantaneously. And what you'll typically find is any changes that end up happening within the external environment tend to increase the business's costs. So for example, if we look at inflation, the general rise of price levels increases the business's cost, maybe the variable cost, because their raw materials have got more expensive. And as we said, adapted to new legislation, with car manufacturers needing to increase their cost into research and development to produce a brand new set of vehicles. The next topic that we're going to look at in this revision video will be the different key factors in change. Now, when change occurs, several key factors will influence the process, and we're going to break each of these down in a lot more detail. First of all, the organisational culture, which is what we've looked at already in theme 3. We'll also look at the size of the organisation, something that we've already covered a little bit on earlier on in this revision video. Then we've got to look at the speed of change, so whether we need to react quite quickly or not. And finally, any resistance to change as well. So the first key factor that we'll take a look at will be organisational culture, which remember is the shared values, beliefs and the behaviours which basically dictate how a business operates. Now, when we look at organisational culture and how that could influence change, the problem is some organisational cultures like the way that they were doing things before. They tend to get stuck in their old ways. One of the worst things that you can hear from an organisational culture and an employee, this is always how we've done it, because that shows that the culture isn't really one to adapt to change. So whether the organisational culture responds well to change or not depends on its adaptability. Are they open to change? Have we got a strong culture which embraces the change and wants to adapt to any changes in the external environment because they know it's going to help benefit the entire organisation? Or do we have quite a weak culture who is stuck in their old ways? And we can also bring in the size of the organisation in relation to the corporate culture, because we'll find that these larger organisations may actually have what we call subcultures. Because if we're hiring tens of thousands of employees, it's going to be quite difficult to unify all of them under one type of culture. So you may find different functions have their own culture, different departments have their own culture, different small teams have their own culture as well. So trying to change the organisation when we've got loads of different cultures going on can become quite difficult. The next thing that we'll take a look at, bit of a nice follow-up, will be the actual size of the organisation and how they begin to manage change. Now, in larger organisation, not only the fact that they may have their own subcultures within a bigger culture, so they may not have that unified workforce, but actually implementing change across an entire organisation can become quite problematic. Because with these larger organisations, you're not just trying to communicate to 100 employees that we're going to go through a big organisational change, we're now trying to get tens of thousands of employees. So with the communication, it's going to take a lot longer because the chain of command is longer. We've got more layers within our hierarchy. And not only that, we've got more stakeholders to consider because a large organisation may have hundreds of suppliers. So what you might find is that smaller businesses, it's easier to manage change because I've got less employees, I've got less stakeholders now to consider when trying to manage change. But that does not mean that change is always easier in smaller businesses, as it may depend on other factors such as what the leader is like. Are they willing to change? What about the corporate culture in that smaller business? Have they got a culture that embraces change? The next key factor of change that we'll take a look at will be the time or speed of the change itself. Now, there's different ways of us categorizing this. First of all, we've got incremental change, which is a bit more gradual. So this is like Tesla improving their battery efficiency in electric vehicles over time. Then we've got more transformational change, which is a bit more rapid. This is like Netflix shifting from DVD rentals to more of the streaming services. Or we've got disruptive, which is more industry changing, such as AI-powered chatbots replacing customer service roles in many different industries. Now, casting your mind back to theme 1, we looked at a topic called dynamic markets, which are characterized by constant and rapid change. So industries like fashion and technology, these will typically experience rapid change. So the organisation has to be set up to be flexible. So the constant changes in the external environment means that they have to constantly be responding to these changes. We could also look at external shocks, such as factors like COVID-19, trade wars, political conflict, war, and so on. Now, typically in external shocks, we have to respond quite quickly to change. Because looking back at COVID-19, when the world went into lockdown, businesses had to respond quite quickly to change. They had to change the entire way the business was operating in order to respond to these external factors. And as well, we looked at different methods of business growth earlier on in Theme 3. We looked at organic methods, inorganic methods, so growing the business through mergers or takeovers. Well, we know if it's organic, the speed of change will be fairly slow. Versus inorganic, these external methods like a merger or takeover, the speed of change will dramatically increase. So once again, we need to make sure our organisation is flexible and responds well to this type of change. And the final key factor will be managing resistance to change. Now, different stakeholders will react to change in various different ways. Some stakeholders may be prompting the change. Other stakeholders may be trying to resist it, but our job as a business is to try and manage the resistance to change in an effective way. So looking at different stakeholders, well, employees, they may not like the change because there is a lot of unknown. So for example, mergers and takeovers, external shocks, they may start to fret around their job security, once again linking this back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So the business will try to manage the resistance of the employees, so making sure they're clearly communicating with them, potentially even offering secure contracts to try and minimise that resistance to change. They also may not like the change that's actually happened because they have to learn all of these different work processes. So from the business's perspective, can we provide training and support? Once again, minimising the resistance to change. Shareholders, they may be all for it or they may be against it. Because think from a shareholder perspective, how is this going to impact their returns? Is this going to impact the profits of the business? Because we know that directly will impact the level of dividends and the increase or decrease of share price. So once again, it's all about communication. We want to make sure that we're communicating our strategies with our shareholders. Customers as well, they once again may be resistant to the change because the product or service quality might change. So we need to make sure once again we maintain our quality standards and we communicate to our customers extremely transparently. And finally, suppliers, they may also face uncertainty because from a supplier's perspective, they want to make sure they're receiving constant orders. So once again, what a business could do to manage this resistance to change is offering the supplier a long-term contract if that is an acceptable thing to do. The next topic that we'll take a look at in this revision video will be about scenario planning and identifying risks. First of all, let's understand what we mean by scenario planning. Now, scenario planning is a strategic tool used to anticipate and prepare for potential future uncertainties by exploring different outcomes. It's about trying to plan for these unexpected events. Scenario planning isn't just about predicting the future and what might happen. It's more so about identifying different scenarios that could happen and how a business would manage and plan for these to try and minimize the impact. Now, for your exam, you don't need to specifically do any risk assessment calculations, but you've already done some form of scenario planning with risks in terms of this decision trees about what is the impact if something was to go wrong. Now I'm going to show you a step-by-step approach of how to actually do scenario planning. First of all, businesses, they must determine any unpredictable factors that could impact them. So for example, a tech company may face a bit of uncertainty about future AI regulations, while a retail business may be concerned more about changing consumer preferences. Then what the business wants to do is to start creating different possible futures based on these uncertainties. So a car manufacturer, for instance, they may consider a scenario where electric vehicle demands grows rapidly and another one where government subsidies for EVs begin to reduce. And then we want to analyse the potential impact that each scenario has. So the business starts to assess how each of those scenarios begin to affect them. So for example, a travel company, they may analyse how an economic downturn could reduce holiday bookings, where a strong economy could increase the demand for luxury travel. Then we want to start formulating these strategies and plan to respond to each scenario. So companies start to prepare flexible strategies to manage risks and potentially seize any opportunities. So for example, a supermarket chain, they might plan to expand its online grocery services if e-commerce demand increases, or they may want to try and strengthen in-store promotion if foot traffic begins to rise. And then finally, we want to make sure we're continuously monitoring and adapting our strategies. So businesses must regularly review and update their plans. So for example, a clothing retailer, they may want to adjust their supply chain strategy if geopolitical tensions disrupt international trade. And what the business would also want to do is they would want to conduct these risk assessments. Now, what a risk assessment is when we identify and manage potential risks to try and minimize any harm and ensure safety within a business. So you typically see a risk assessment within workplace safety. So for example, a construction company, they may conduct a risk assessment to potentially identify any different hazards within the workplace, such as unsafe scaffolding, any heavy objects that could fall on you. And then what they would want to do is to implement any safety measures to prevent these risks from occurring. And a risk assessment will typically identify the following risks. We've got natural disasters, IT systems failures, and loss of key staff. Let's once again break each of these down in a bit more detail. Starting off with natural disasters. Now, natural disasters typically cause supply chain disruptions. So for example, if I'm importing goods from overseas and there was a natural disaster that happened in that country, then that could cause major delays of me getting the products from them. Of course, it may cause financial losses because it may damage infrastructure, it may damage business buildings, and finally, it could provide risk to employee safety. So if a natural disaster was to occur when employees are in the workplace, once again, it could cause some damage to the buildings whilst the employees are in there. Now, in the UK, we don't see as many natural disasters as other countries around the world. The one that we typically do is flooding. However, and we'll once again look at this in a lot more detail across theme 4, but because of globalization, you're typically getting your raw materials from across the world. So those natural disasters that are happening in other countries will definitely have a knock-on effect on us. The next one will also be around IT systems failures. Now, I can guarantee 99.9999% of businesses nowadays use some form of IT systems within their company. So for example, it could be around managing their operations. It could also be around their financial systems as well, so having accounting systems and software. And most businesses will also be using IT systems to try and communicate, maybe communicating with their customers on social media, maybe having a website that they sell their products through. So when an IT system failure happens, these will typically cause massive disruptions to the business. Because if I'm selling all my products and services through e-commerce, but I have an IT system failure and the website goes down, then for a period of time, I'm not able to make any revenue. And not only that, businesses are now facing even more threats around cybersecurity attacks. So this can compromise data. So key personal data about our customers can then be leaked, and that could cause us a lot of issues. Once again, disruptions in operations, maybe uploading viruses to our IT software. And overall, this would result in losses for the business. And the problem is for most businesses, it's not until they have a cybersecurity breach until they start taking this seriously. So it's so important for a business to be conducting their risk assessments on these IT system failures, and especially around their cybersecurity, and have those safety precautions in place. And finally, we could also look at loss of key staff. Now, this could be for any reason. Maybe they just want to leave the business, they're retiring, they go off work because they're ill, they may have maternity or paternity leave, and so on. Now, losing key staff can be quite detrimental for a business. Now, there is an example of Nike where during the big growth phase of Nike and when it was starting to become really popular, one of the key senior leaders of the actual Nike board left Nike and went to work at Adidas. Now, this was really bad for Nike because that individual took all of their knowledge about Nike, the operation systems, and then moved to Adidas and obviously implemented a lot of the strategies there. Now, at the time, Phil Knight admitted that in the contract, he should have had a non-compete clause. And that's why you'll find most businesses having these non-compete clauses where they can't just go to a business, take all their information and go work at a rival. And the higher they are within the organizational hierarchy, this is when it has more of a negative impact. Now, of course, if we lose any low-skilled employees who are towards the bottom of the hierarchy, yes, it can be a bad thing, but it's nowhere near going to have as large of impact as if we were losing someone from the senior positions. So we need to start considering, well, how will the business look at replacing these key staff if they were to leave? And the key way of doing this is implementing something that is called succession planning. Let's take a look at what that is now. And the very last thing that we now need to do in this revision session, carrying on with that scenario planning, will be planning for any risk mitigation. First of all, what actually is risk mitigation? Well, this is the process of identifying, assessing, and implementing strategies to reduce or minimize potential risks. Now, it's key to note that we can't completely remove any risk from the business, but we do want to try and reduce the possibility of it happening or the impact it would have on the company if it was to happen. Now, some risk mitigation examples. First of all, we can implement cybersecurity, so installing firewalls, two-factor authorization. This just helps reduces the risk of a cybersecurity attack. We could also look at diversifying our suppliers, because if we was just to rely on a singular supplier and they was to go out of business, then that could really negatively impact me because where am I going to get my supplies from? So maybe having a couple suppliers that we are working with. Of course, insurance as well to protect you from any financial losses. So for example, that's why we have car insurance, because if there ever was that accident, at least we will have some form of financial protection. Data and storage backups as well. If a company loses key data, this can really disrupt their overall business. So making sure that we do have backups just in case something was to happen. And finally as well, having health and safety protocols. Some people think it's boring, others will say it is necessary because you want to reduce the risk that something does end up happening within the workplace. Now, as part of risk mitigation, we've got these two important concepts: business continuity and succession planning. Let's first of all understand what we mean by business continuity. Well, essentially, business continuity is the process of ensuring a company can still maintain their operations and recover quickly during disruptions or crisis. So an example of business continuity is a retail business implementing an online sales platform to continue their operations during a store closure, potentially caused by a natural disaster, or of course COVID-19. Then we've got something called succession planning, which is what we mentioned towards the end of the last section. And what succession planning is, it's the process of identifying and developing employees to fill key leadership roles in the future. So we want to make sure that when those people in those key leadership roles do eventually end up leaving the business, that we have someone to replace them. We want to make this a seamless process, because during that time of trying to find someone new to replace them, once again, disruptions can start to happen. And what makes succession planning really tricky is that we don't always know when an employee is going to leave the business. Yes, most of the time they may say to the actual business itself. I'm going to be retiring within the next 6 to 12 months, but we don't always have that luxury because we do have issues with illness, we have issues with death, maternity, paternity leave. So this is why typically a senior leadership role may have a number 2 in charge. If you've been finding these revision videos useful, then I highly recommend you check out our video here on theme 4.1 globalization, because we're going to be going through some key factors that you need to know for your paper 1 and 3 exams, such as international trade, protectionism, what import, what exports are, and so much more. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video has helped you with your theme 3 revision, and I'll see you in the next one.